You have 72 hours to dismantle the unauthorized structure, or a daily fine of $200 will be levied against your property. That was the first line of the letter. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war, printed on cheap paper but sealed with the ironclad authority of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The unauthorized structure was my greenhouse. It was my late wife Sarah's final project, a dream she'd sketched on napkins and researched for years. After I lost her, finishing it became my mission, my therapy. It was a beautiful thing, a cathedral of glass and cedar, built with the same precision I used in my work as a structural engineer. It wasn't some plastic-sheeted monstrosity, it was a testament to her memory, and every beam, every pane of glass, was placed with love. And now, Carol wanted it gone. I had moved to Maple Creek Estates seeking tranquility. After decades of designing bridges and skyscrapers, of wrestling with city permits and concrete pours, all I wanted was quiet. I wanted to hear birds, not jackhammers. I wanted to smell freshly cut grass, not diesel fumes. Sarah and I had bought the house for its large, private backyard, a perfect canvas for the garden she'd always wanted. Following her passing, that garden, and especially the new greenhouse, was the only thing that kept me anchored. The community itself was idyllic on the surface. Manicured lawns stretched out like green carpets, the houses were all painted in a palette of approved, muted earth tones, and the silence was broken only by the hum of electric lawnmowers and the distant laughter of children. But beneath that placid surface was the churning, tyrannical engine of the HOA, and at its helm was Carol. Carol was a woman who seemed to be powered by pure, unadulterated spite. She was the self-appointed queen of our little fiefdom, patrolling the streets in her golf cart, a clipboard of violations clutched in her hand like a scepter. She saw the world not in shades of gray, but in infractions and compliance. A garbage can left out an hour too late, a rogue garden gnome, a flag flown on a non-approved holiday. These were not minor oversights to Carol, they were acts of rebellion that had to be crushed. I'd had a few minor run-ins with her before. A notice about the length of my grass, which I'd let grow a quarter-inch too long while I was grieving. A warning about my car being parked on the street for 20 minutes while I unloaded groceries. I'd complied each time, not because I agreed, but because I craved peace. I was a man who built things to last, to withstand storms and stresses. I didn't have the energy for petty squabbles. I was building a new life, a quiet life, and confrontation was a stress fracture I didn't need. But the greenhouse was different. It wasn't a misplaced garbage can. It was a part of Sarah. Tearing it down would have felt like a second funeral. The letter cited Bylaw 7, Section C, all outbuildings, sheds, and secondary structures must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee, a committee of one, chaired and solely populated by Carol herself. I knew for a fact I'd submitted the plans. I had the certified mail receipt to prove it. She had simply ignored it, waiting until the structure was complete to strike. It was a classic power play, designed to show everyone who was in charge. I folded the letter, the paper crinkling under the pressure of my grip. My initial reaction wasn't rage, but a deep, weary sigh. It felt like trying to reason with a force of nature, like arguing with an earthquake. But I had to try. For Sarah. I decided to approach this like any engineering problem, analyze the structure of the situation, identify the points of failure, and apply pressure where it would be most effective. My first step was simple, direct communication. I walked over to her house that evening, the letter in my hand. Her home was, of course, the model of HOA compliance. Not a blade of grass was out of place. Her petunias were arranged with militaristic precision. She answered the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. "Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Carol," I said, keeping my own voice level. "I received your letter about my greenhouse." Her smile widened slightly. "Ah, yes. The structure. A shame you didn't seek approval first. The rules are quite clear." "I did seek approval," I stated calmly. "I sent the plans via certified mail 3 months ago. I have the receipt. According to the bylaws, if the committee doesn't respond within 30 days, the plans are considered automatically approved." I had her. It was a clean, logical point, supported by her own rules. A flicker of something, annoyance. Surprise, crossed her face before being replaced by a mask of condescending pity. "Oh, Arthur. We never received anything," she lied, smooth as polished concrete. "The post office can be so unreliable. Regardless, it's an eyesore. It lowers the aesthetic value of the entire neighborhood. It has to go. An eyesore. My beautiful, cedar-framed greenhouse. The one my neighbors had complimented me on. It was a lie, and we both knew it. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about her authority being challenged by my circumvention of her, even if it was a circumvention allowed by her own rulebook. I'm not tearing it down, Carol." The fake smile vanished. The mask was off. "Then you'll be fined. Daily. Until you are in compliance. We can put a lien on your house. We can force a sale. Do you understand what I'm saying? I run this neighborhood. You will comply." I just looked at her. Her face was flushed, her eyes hard. I saw the ugly truth of the situation. Reason wouldn't work. The system was designed to fail. The bylaws were not a contract among neighbors, they were her personal cudgel. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice cold now. "You've made your position clear." I turned and walked away, her glare burning into my back. The battle lines were drawn. She had started a war over a building of glass and wood and memories. She had no idea how strong the foundation of that building really was. She had no idea how strong I could be when defending it. The next day, the harassment began in earnest. A second letter appeared, this one taped to my front door, announcing the first $200 fine. It was accompanied by a photograph of the greenhouse, taken from the street, with a big red circle drawn around it as if it were evidence in a crime scene. I ignored it. I paid the fine, but I included a letter with the check stating that it was being paid, under protest, and that I reserved all rights to reclaim the funds. Legally, it was a small but important step. It showed I was not accepting the legitimacy of her claim. Carol escalated. She began a campaign on the community's private Facebook page. She posted the same photo with the red circle. "Dear neighbors," she wrote, "I'm so sorry that we all have to look at this monstrosity. Some people have no respect for our community standards or property values. Rest assured, the HOA is taking firm action." The comments section was a mix. A few of her sycophants chimed in with, "Thank you for protecting our neighborhood, Carol," and "How awful." But I was surprised to see a few brave souls push back. My next-door neighbor, a quiet woman named Mary, wrote, "I think it's a lovely greenhouse. Arthur did a beautiful job." Her comment was deleted within minutes. Carol then called the county code enforcement office, filing an anonymous complaint that I had built an unsafe structure without a permit. I spent a morning with a county inspector, a weary-looking man named Dave. I showed him my plans, my permits, which I had, of course, properly secured, and the structure itself. Dave walked around the greenhouse, tapping on the frame, checking the foundation points. He looked at my blueprints, his eyes widening slightly. "Mister, you could park a tank on this roof," he said, shaking his head. "This is built better than my own house. There's nothing wrong here." That woman is wasting my time again. Again? I asked. "Oh yeah," he sighed. "We get a call from this address, about this neighborhood, at least once a week. Illegal fences, sheds that are 2 inches too tall, you name it. 99% of the time, it's nothing. She just likes sicking the government on people." He stamped my inspection report with a "No violations found," and left, muttering about paperwork. Carol's failure with code enforcement only seemed to fuel her rage. The fines continued to stack up. I was now getting daily letters. She started taking pictures of other things. My garden hose was improperly coiled, a single dandelion near my mailbox was a noxious weed violation, each came with a $50 fine. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. The community became a tense place. People would see me and quickly look away, afraid to be seen talking to the neighborhood pariah. A couple of neighbors would give me a sympathetic nod when Carol wasn't looking, but no one wanted to get caught in her crossfire. I was an island, and the water level of Carol's petty tyranny was rising. Still, I held my ground. The greenhouse was thriving. I was growing Sarah's favorite flowers, peonies, lilies, and a particularly difficult strain of climbing rose. The work was therapeutic. Inside those glass walls, the HOA didn't exist. It was just me, the soil, and her memory. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning. I went out to water the garden and found it. One of Sarah's prize-winning rose bushes, a beautiful Queen Elizabeth that she had babied for years, was hacked to pieces. The branches were crudely severed, the delicate pink blooms lying scattered and crushed on the ground. The bush was planted right beside the greenhouse, a clear and unmistakable message. This was no longer about bylaws or aesthetics. This was a direct, vicious, personal attack. She had crossed a line from administrative bullying to outright vandalism. She had desecrated a memorial. I stood there, looking at the butchered plant, and the weariness I had felt for weeks evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard anger. It settled deep in my bones, a foundation of fury. The engineer in me, the part that had been trying to de-escalate and find a peaceful solution, went silent. A different part of me took over. The part that designed systems to withstand immense pressure. The part that understands that sometimes, the only way to deal with a destructive force is to dismantle it, piece by piece. She thought this was a fight about a greenhouse. She was wrong. This was now a fight about everything. And it was a fight she was going to lose. That afternoon, I didn't file a police report. There was no proof it was her, just a strong suspicion. A report would go nowhere. My response had to be more calculated. This was no longer a defensive action. I was moving to offense. My first step was to transform my property into a fortress of documentation. I went online and ordered a set of high-definition, weatherproof security cameras. Not the cheap ones, but a professional-grade system with night vision and motion-activated recording that would upload directly to a secure cloud server. I spent the weekend installing them, my movements precise and efficient. One camera was aimed directly at the greenhouse and the damaged rose bush. Another covered my front door and mailbox. A third had a wide-angle view of the street, including the front of Carol's house across the way. Next, I went to the county records office. I spent an entire day pulling documents. I requested the original plat maps for the Maple Creek Estates development. I downloaded the HOA's Articles of Incorporation, all of its filed bylaws, and, most importantly, its annual financial statements for the past 5 years. I took it all home and spread it across my dining room table. It was like a new set of blueprints, but instead of a building, I was analyzing the architecture of Carol's power. For days, I sifted through the legalese and the numbers, my engineer's mind finding patterns. The bylaws were a mess of contradictions, amended so many times they were nearly incoherent. But the financials were where I struck gold. The HOA's biggest expense, by a huge margin, was landscaping. The contract was with a company called Prestigescapes LLC. The payments were astronomical, far beyond what would be reasonable for maintaining the small common areas and the front entrance. I did a quick business search. Prestigescapes LLC was registered to a man named David Miller. A little more digging on social media, and I found it. David Miller was Carol's brother-in-law. It was a classic kickback scheme, hidden in plain sight. Carol approved the outrageously inflated invoices, and her family reaped the profits. The fines she levied against residents weren't just for power, they were to offset the money she was bleeding from the association's coffers. She was using the residents' money to enrich her own family, then fining those same residents for trivial nonsense to balance the books. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. It was a structurally unsound system, rotting from the inside. This was the weakness. This was the load-bearing wall I could knock out to bring the whole rotten structure down. But I needed more than just suspicious financials and a family connection. A smart lawyer could explain that away as a coincidence or bad judgment. I needed irrefutable proof. I needed to catch her in the act. I needed to bait a trap. My strategic plan began to form, a multi-phased project I internally labeled Operation Greenhouse Effect. The goal was not just to win, but to achieve a form of poetic justice. Her downfall had to be public, undeniable, and directly linked to the very thing she was trying to destroy, my greenhouse. Phase 1 was about setting the stage. I started being meticulously, unnervingly polite to Carol. When I saw her on her golf cart patrol, I would wave and smile broadly. I continued to pay the fines under protest, but now my letters were cheerful. Dear Carol, I'd write, enclosed as payment for the fine regarding my improperly coiled hose. Hope you're having a wonderful week. This change in demeanor was designed to confuse and agitate her. A target that fights back is predictable. A target that smiles while you hit them is terrifying. Phase 2 was the bait. And I had the perfect lure. I was an avid amateur botanist, a hobby I'd shared with Sarah. We had a particular fondness for rare orchids. Before she passed, we had acquired a few bulbs of a very special flower, the blue monarch orchid. It was a notoriously difficult plant to cultivate, known for its stunning, vibrant blue petals that were almost iridescent. It was also, as I knew from a local news article a few months back, the official flower of the mayor's upcoming re-election campaign. His wife was a passionate gardener and was using the blue monarch as a symbol of rare integrity and beauty for the campaign. They were paying a premium to a specialty nursery across the state for a steady supply. I got to work. Inside my greenhouse, under the carefully controlled light and humidity, I began to cultivate the orchids. It took weeks of patient, meticulous care, but soon, the first buds began to appear. When they bloomed, they were magnificent. A sea of impossible blue, right here in my Eyesore greenhouse. Phase 3 was letting the world know. I didn't post on the HOA Facebook page. Instead, I called the local newspaper's gardening columnist. I told her I was a local hobbyist who had successfully cultivated a batch of the rare blue monarch orchid. She was intrigued. She came out, took some beautiful photos of the orchids inside the greenhouse, and wrote a lovely little human interest story. It ran in the Sunday paper. The article was a small, localized bombshell. The next day, I got a call. It was from the mayor's campaign manager. He had seen the article. He was ecstatic. Buying the flowers from across the state was expensive and unreliable. Having a local, dedicated source. It was a godsend. We quickly negotiated a contract. I would provide all the blue monarch orchids for the remainder of the campaign, for decorations at rallies, for VIP bouquets, for press events. The price they offered was generous, but that wasn't the point. The point was that my greenhouse, Carol's monstrosity, was now an official supplier to the most powerful political office in the city. It was no longer just my private property, it was a campaign asset. An attack on the greenhouse was now an attack on the mayor's re-election bid. I made sure Carol saw it. I left a copy of the newspaper article in my mailbox, sticking out just enough for her to notice. I saw her snatch it on her morning patrol, her golf cart screeching to a halt. I watched from my window as she read it, her face contorting into a mask of pure fury. The trap was set. The bait was in the water. I just had to wait for the shark to bite. I didn't have to wait long. Carol's rage, simmering for weeks, finally boiled over. Her campaign of petty harassment had failed. Her attempt to use code enforcement had backfired. Now, her designated neighborhood eyesore was getting positive press and was linked to the mayor. She couldn't stand it. Her control was slipping, and she was becoming reckless. The first sign was the escalation of her online attacks. She created anonymous accounts to leave nasty comments on the newspaper's website under the article about my orchids. "This man is a menace to his neighborhood," one comment read. "Don't be fooled by pretty flowers, he's a rule breaker who thinks he's above everyone else." The language was so transparently Carol that it was almost comical. But the real move came a few nights later. It was just after midnight. My motion-activated camera sent a silent alert to my phone. I watched the live feed, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic beat. A shadowy figure was creeping along the side of my house, heading directly for the greenhouse. The figure was carrying a small spray tank. It was Carol. She was dressed in dark clothing, a hoodie pulled over her head, but the camera's night vision captured her face as clear as day. I watched, my breath held, as she fumbled with the nozzle on the spray tank. She was planning to poison the orchids, to destroy the source of my victory right under my nose. She crept up to the glass wall of the greenhouse, raised the sprayer, and aimed it at the ventilation slats. I had designed the ventilation system myself. The slats were covered with a fine mesh screen to keep insects out. It would also, I knew, be just effective enough to block most of a liquid spray, causing it to bead up and run down the outside of the glass. She wouldn't be able to do much damage to the plants, but the attempt itself was everything. She sprayed for a full minute, dousing the side of the greenhouse with what I later learned was a potent herbicide. The camera recorded it all in crystal clear high definition, her face, the sprayer, the act of malicious destruction. When she was done, she scurried back across the lawn and disappeared into her own home. I saved the video file to 3 separate locations, including the secure cloud server. This was the first piece of hard, undeniable evidence. The first steel beam in the case I was building against her. The next HOA meeting was 2 weeks later. I decided not to reveal the video. Not yet. That was my trump card, and it wasn't time to play it. Instead, I would use the meeting to apply pressure to the financial crack I had discovered. I prepared a short presentation, complete with charts and figures I'd put together from the HOA's own financial reports. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with folding chairs and bad coffee. Carol sat at the head table, looking smug and self-important. She had no idea what was coming. When the floor was opened for new business, I raised my hand. "Yes, Arthur," Carol said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you have another complaint about our clearly stated rules?" "No, Carol," I said, standing up and walking to the front of the room. "I have a question about our budget." I handed out copies of my analysis to the 20 or so residents in attendance. "I've been reviewing the association's expenditures for the past 5 years, I began, my voice calm and professional, the same voice I used to brief city planning commissions. And I've noticed a significant anomaly in our landscaping costs. They have increased by over 300% in 5 years, while our service area has remained the same. We are currently paying Prestige Scapes LLC nearly 4 times the market rate for basic groundskeeping." A murmur went through the room. People started looking at the numbers I'd provided. They were clear and damning. "Furthermore," I continued, "I think it's a matter of public interest for the board to disclose that the owner of Prestige Scapes is, in fact, our president's brother-in-law, David Miller." The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. All eyes turned to Carol. Her face, which had been a mask of smug authority, was now pale. 2 bright red spots of anger appeared on her cheeks. "That is an outrageous and slanderous accusation," she sputtered, rising to her feet. "My family connections have nothing to do with my duties as president. Prestige Scapes provides excellent service. 4 times the market rate is not excellent service, it's robbery," my neighbor Mary said quietly from the back. A few other people nodded in agreement. Carol's eyes darted around the room, seeing for the first time that her iron grip might not be as secure as she thought. Her authority was being questioned, her cash cow threatened. She turned her glare on me, her eyes burning with pure hatred. "This is nothing but a personal vendetta because you were fined for your illegal greenhouse," she shrieked. "You are a troublemaker, and I will not stand here and be insulted. This meeting is adjourned." She slammed her gavel down and stormed out of the room, her followers trailing nervously behind her. It was a chaotic end to the meeting, but it was a victory. I had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the residents. I had shown them the numbers. For the first time, they weren't just looking at me as the neighborhood problem, they were looking at Carol and wondering what else she was hiding. Her composure was cracking like cheap concrete under pressure. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that she was about to do something even more reckless. Carol's reaction was faster and more vicious than I could have imagined. Cornered and publicly humiliated, she abandoned all pretense of following rules or maintaining appearances. She went for the jugular. 2 days after the meeting, 2 police officers showed up at my door. They looked uncomfortable. One of them, a senior officer named Miller, held up a piece of paper. "Sir," he said, "we've received a complaint from a Ms. Carol Peterson. She's filed for a temporary restraining order against you, alleging harassment and stalking." I was stunned. Harassment. I had spoken to her a grand total of 3 times in the last month, one of which was at a public meeting. "She claims you follow her, that you take pictures of her house, and that you've been slandering her to the neighbors," the officer continued, reading from the report. "She says she's in fear for her safety." The pictures of her house, he meant my security camera, which had a wide-angle view that happened to include her property across the street. She was twisting every defensive measure I had taken into an act of aggression. It was a bold, despicable lie, but one that the legal system had to take seriously. I explained the situation calmly, told them about the HOA dispute, and even offered to show them my camera setup and explain its purpose. Officer Miller just sighed. Look, sir, right now this is a civil matter. The judge granted the temporary order. You have to stay 100 yards away from her and her property. There's a hearing in 2 weeks where you can tell your side. Until then, just keep your distance. The next attack came through the community's social fabric. Carol and her cronies launched a full-scale smear campaign. They went door to door, telling people that I was an unstable, aggressive man. That my wife's death had unhinged me. They started a rumor, a truly vile one, that I was using the greenhouse to grow something other than flowers. The implication was disgusting and clear. The worst of it was when she tried to get me fired. She found out where I worked, my engineering firm was a matter of public record, and she called my boss. She told him I was a dangerous and litigious individual who was criminally harassing her. She claimed I was using company resources to stalk her. My boss, a man I had known and respected for 20 years, called me into his office. He looked more concerned than angry. Arthur, what the hell is going on? I just got a 30-minute earful from some crazy woman about your home life. I spent an hour explaining the entire situation, from the first fine to the restraining order. I showed him the letters, the photos, the financial analysis I had done. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. My sister deals with an HOA president just like this, he said. They're little tyrants in search of a kingdom. Don't worry, Arthur. Your job is safe. This is clearly a personal vendetta. But you need to handle it. This woman sounds dangerous. He was right. She was dangerous. But her escalating attacks were also the actions of a desperate person. And desperate people make mistakes. Her biggest mistake was thinking she had bullied everyone into silence. That evening, I got a knock on my back door. It was George, the HOA treasurer. He was a small, nervous man who always seemed to be sweating, even in winter. He looked terrified, clutching a manila envelope to his chest. "Can I come in?" he whispered, darting his eyes around my backyard as if expecting Carol to pop out from behind a bush. I let him in, and he practically collapsed onto a kitchen chair. "I can't do it anymore," he stammered. "She's gone crazy. After the meeting, she told me I needed to fix the budget, cook the books to hide the payments to her brother-in-law. She wants me to commit fraud." He pushed the manila envelope across the table. "I've been the treasurer for 3 years. I always thought the landscaping fees were high, but I was too scared to question her. She has a file on everyone, you know. Dirt. She threatened to tell my wife about, well, it doesn't matter. But this is a felony. I'm not going to prison for her." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. It was the smoking gun. Inside were copies of the actual invoices from Prestige Scapes LLC. And stapled to the back of each one was a copy of a second invoice, from a shell corporation I'd never heard of, billing Prestige Scapes for consulting fees. The consulting fees were exactly 50% of the original invoice amount. At the bottom of the shell corporation's documents was the owner's name, Carol Peterson. It wasn't just a kickback to her brother-in-law. It was direct, provable embezzlement. She was laundering the HOA's money through her family's business and paying half of it directly to herself. George had also included copies of emails from Carol, explicitly instructing him on how to process the payments. "Make sure this is paid net 15, George. My consultant needs to be paid promptly." "She's stealing from all of us," I said, looking at the documents spread across my table. "For years," George confirmed, wiping sweat from his brow. "There's over $100,000 in there. Probably more. I have to testify. I have to tell the police what I know. Will you come with me?" "Yes, George," I said, my voice steady and hard as steel. "I will." The next morning, George and I walked into the downtown police station, bypassing the front desk and asking for the Economic Crimes Unit. We spent 4 hours with a detective, a sharp woman who listened intently as we laid out the entire story. I provided my evidence, the video of Carol attempting to vandalize my greenhouse, the false restraining order, the threatening letters. George provided his, the invoices, the emails, the direct testimony of a co-conspirator who was ready to flip. The detective's eyes lit up when she saw the financial documents. This was no longer a petty neighborhood squabble. This was felony-grade fraud. From there, things moved quickly. The police handed the case to the district attorney's office. An assistant DA, a young, ambitious man named Mr. Hayes, was assigned the case. He called me the next day. "Mr. Davies," he said, "this is one of the cleanest cases of embezzlement I've ever seen. We have her dead to rights on the fraud. The video of the attempted vandalism and the false police report for the restraining order just make it even better. We're going to press charges. But I have an idea, if you're amenable, of how to make this particularly effective." He wanted to orchestrate a public arrest. "This woman thrives on public perception and power," he explained. "The most fitting end to her reign is for it to happen in front of the very people she terrorized." The plan was simple. We would use the HOA's own bylaws, which allowed any 10 homeowners to call for a special meeting. We would call a community-wide meeting to discuss urgent financial and security matters. The DA's office would have plainclothes officers in attendance. When I presented the evidence, they would make the arrest. Before we set the date, I made one more call. I called the mayor's office. Not his campaign manager, but his direct line. I introduced myself as the man providing the blue monarch orchids. I then calmly explained that the person responsible for the HOA trying to tear down the greenhouse where those orchids were grown was now being investigated for multiple felonies, and that she had filed false police reports against me in an attempt to silence me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The political implications were not lost on them. An official supplier to the mayor's campaign being harassed by a criminal. It was a PR nightmare in the making. "The mayor will be at your meeting," his chief of staff said finally, his voice cold. "He takes community safety and integrity very seriously." The final piece was in place. The stage was set for the final act. Carol had tried to destroy my life with lies, threats, and public shaming. Now, she would face her judgment in the most public way possible. The night of the special meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. Word had gotten out that something big was happening. The presence of the mayor, who stood grim-faced at the back of the room with his chief of staff, amplified the tension to an almost unbearable level. Every chair was filled, and people were standing along the walls. Carol sat at the head table, looking flustered but defiant. She clearly thought this meeting was another attempt by me to challenge her authority, one she was prepared to shout down. She had no idea she was walking into her own execution. George, the treasurer, sat beside her, looking pale but resolute. He gave me a single, sharp nod. I had requested to be the first speaker on the agenda. When my name was called, I walked to the podium at the front of the room, carrying a laptop and a small projector. The room fell silent. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steady and clear, echoing slightly in the quiet room. "We're here tonight to discuss urgent financial and security matters that affect every single homeowner in Maple Creek Estates. For the last several months, I, and others, have been the target of a campaign of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power by our HOA president, Carol Peterson." Carol jumped to her feet. "This is out of order. You are violating a restraining order by even being here and addressing me. I'm calling the police." "That won't be necessary, Miss Peterson," a calm voice said from the back. One of the plainclothes detectives, a man I recognized from the station, took a step forward. "The temporary order against Mr. Davies was vacated by a judge this morning in light of new evidence. Please, sit down." Carol stared, dumbfounded, and slowly sank back into her chair. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. "The harassment," I continued, "began with my greenhouse, which Miss Peterson deemed an eyesore when I refused to tear it down. She escalated. This is security footage from my property, taken at 12:15 a.m. on the night of October 27th. I clicked a button on my laptop. The projector whirred to life, displaying a massive, crystal-clear image on the wall behind me. The grainy, night vision footage showed Carol, her face unmistakable, creeping onto my property and spraying the side of my greenhouse with herbicide. The room erupted in gasps. "This was a criminal act of vandalism," I said, pausing the video on a perfect close-up of her face. "But it gets worse." I then laid out the financial case. With methodical precision, I walked the audience through the invoices, the shell corporation, the emails. I put the documents George had given me up on the screen, highlighting Carol's name, her signature, the account numbers. The evidence was overwhelming, simple to understand, and utterly damning. For 5 years, I concluded, my voice ringing with cold anger, Carol Peterson has been embezzling our HOA dues. She has stolen more than $100,000 from us, her neighbors. She used inflated contracts with her own family to line her pockets, and then she used fines and intimidation to silence anyone who might ask questions. The room was in an uproar. People were shouting, pointing at Carol, their faces masks of betrayal and fury. They finally understood where their money had been going. They understood the true reason behind her tyrannical rule. Carol was completely unraveling. Her face was a blotchy, crimson mess. Her eyes were wild. This was not happening. This could not be happening. Her perfect little kingdom was crumbling around her. Lies. It's all lies, she shrieked, scrambling to her feet. He faked those documents. He's a criminal. George, tell them. Tell them he's lying. George stood up slowly. He looked at Carol, and for the first time, there was no fear in his eyes. Only pity. No, Carol, he said, his voice shaking but clear. It's all true. And I've given a full confession to the district attorney. That was the final blow. Carol let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She pointed a trembling finger at me. You did this. I will destroy you. I will sue you for everything you have. You will regret the day you ever built that stupid greenhouse. As she was spewing her threats, the two detectives moved forward, flanking her at the table. Carol Peterson, the first detective said, his voice cutting through her tirade. You are under arrest for felony embezzlement, insurance fraud, and filing a false police report. The sight of the handcuffs clicking onto her wrists sent a final, convulsive shock through the room. The Queen was deposed. Her power, which had seemed so absolute just moments before, had evaporated into nothing. The mayor watched the whole scene with a stony expression, then turned and gave me a curt, respectful nod. As they led her out of the clubhouse, a sobbing, hysterical mess, she craned her neck to scream one last thing at me. This isn't over, Arthur. I'll get you for this. But it was over. Her final threat was just noise, the last gasp of a failed tyrant. It was as hollow and impotent as she now was. I stood at the podium, the projector still illuminating the proof of her crimes on the wall, and felt a quiet, profound sense of justice settling over me. The storm had passed. In the immediate aftermath of Carol's public downfall, a wave of liberation swept through Maple Creek Estates. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from the community's shoulders. Neighbors who had been afraid to make eye contact were now stopping to chat in the street. The oppressive silence was replaced by the sounds of kids playing, of friendly conversation, of a neighborhood coming back to life. An emergency election was held for the HOA board. A slate of reasonable, community-minded residents was voted in. Their first official act was to call a bylaw jubilee. They went through the rulebook, page by page, and ceremoniously shredded every petty, vindictive, and nonsensical rule Carol had put in place. The rule about garbage can placement, the restrictions on holiday decorations, the approved color palette for mailboxes, all gone. My neighbor Mary, now the new HOA president, personally delivered a letter to my house. It was an official apology from the board and a check for the full amount of every fine I had paid under protest. The community began to heal. The oppressive atmosphere of suspicion was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of cooperation. People started helping each other with yard work. A neighborhood barbecue was planned. The change was palpable. They weren't just residents anymore, they were neighbors again. Carol's fate was a swift and brutal lesson in consequences. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence and George's testimony, she took a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. She was convicted on multiple felony counts of embezzlement and fraud. The judge, citing her egregious abuse of trust and the malicious, targeted nature of her harassment campaign against me, was not lenient. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. The financial ruin was just as complete. The court ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, a sum totaling nearly $150,000 when all was said and done. Her husband, who claimed to have known nothing of her schemes, divorced her while she was awaiting sentencing. They were forced to sell their meticulously compliant house to pay the legal fees and the restitution. The last I heard, she had lost her appeal, and her brother-in-law's company, Prestige, had declared bankruptcy after being blacklisted by every neighborhood in the city. Her entire, carefully constructed world had been brought down by the very person she had tried to crush. I became something of a reluctant local hero. People would wave as I worked in my garden. They'd thank me for standing up to her. I appreciated the sentiment, but I never wanted the attention. I wasn't a hero, I was just a man who had been pushed too far, a man defending his wife's memory. My engineering skills, which I had used my whole life to build physical structures, had been repurposed to dismantle a social one. It was a strange, but satisfying, application of my trade. I reflected often on the whole sordid affair. It was a stark reminder that bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, often build their thrones on foundations of lies and fear. And like any poorly engineered structure, all it takes is applying pressure to the right weak point to bring the whole thing crashing down. Carol thought her power came from her rules and her title, but it was an illusion. Real strength, I realized, comes from integrity, from patience, and from the quiet determination to protect what you love. A few months later, on a bright, sunny afternoon, I stood inside my greenhouse. The air was warm and humid, thick with the sweet scent of blooming flowers. The blue monarch orchids were in full bloom again, a spectacular wave of vibrant blue. The mayor had won his re-election in a landslide, and his wife had sent me a personal, handwritten note thanking me for my contribution, calling the orchids their lucky charm. Sunlight streamed through the glass panes, the same panes of glass that had been the catalyst for the entire war. The greenhouse was no longer a symbol of conflict. It was a symbol of peace, of resilience. It was Sarah's dream, and now it was my sanctuary. I picked up a watering can and tended to her roses, the new growth strong and healthy where the old branches had been hacked away. I had finally found the quiet I had been looking for. The structure was sound. My life was back in compliance.